What is the historical context of the document? This is really important, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around at first, but think about the idea of context. When we were in grade school, we learned about using context clues to figure out what words mean. So if you don't know what a word means, so for example, going back to this word inundation, Lord of the fish, during the inundation, no bird alights on the crops. Well, maybe you're not sure what inundation means, but you can use some context clues from the paragraphs around that to figure out that, well, we're talking about the Nile. Okay, we're talking about the Nile flooding. Maybe inundation means flooding. Historical documents are the same way. They exist within this context. This exists within the context of Egypt. If we were to read this document and not know that the Nile was worshipped as a god, then it would make a lot less sense. So it's important to connect the information that you have about the particular civilization to the document. It's important to put it in its historical context. All right, so we have pretty much identified the document. That's kind of the basic level. Now we want to try to think a little bit more deeply about it. So why was this document written? Well, it appears that this document was written to worship the Nile. It might also serve the purpose of educating people about the Nile. That would certainly have been important because while clearly the Nile is, the best thing since sliced bread, that's not always the case. So people need to know what they need to do in order to ensure that the Nile continues to bring the inundation. If you'll remember when we scroll down a little bit towards the end, if you have refused to grant nourishment, the dwelling is silent, devoid of all that is good. The country falls exhausted. So if the Nile fails to inundate, then basically Egypt is screwed. What type of document is this? Well, as we talked about before, this is a hymn. And then you want to think a little bit about what is that going to mean for this document? Well, this means that, as we can see, this guy pretty much thinks that the Nile is the best thing since sliced bread. It is overly, what's the word I'm looking for? It is very praiseful. This is not, for example, an academic piece of prose about the god of the Nile. This is praise for the god of the Nile. Some basic assumptions. Well, one basic assumption is that the Nile is a god. We might also say that there's the assumption that it's the inundation of the Nile that continues to bring life to Egypt. It's the inundation of the Nile that brings civilization to Egypt. If we look at this, if we really analyze what is being said here. As well, there's the assumption that the deeds of men have some connection to the inundation of the Nile. And here we have the opportunity to make a connection to the things that we have learned about Egypt. So going back to that idea of historical context. And you really want to be doing this. You want to be making connections between the documents and the stuff that we're talking about in the lessons and in your textbook and on the discussion boards. So we learned in both the reading and in the lesson, in the last lesson, that in Egypt they have this idea of ma'at, or the divine balance, and that it's the responsibility of the pharaoh to preserve this divine balance. And we can relate this idea of balance back to the Nile, which did indeed flood on a really regular basis. And this resulted in the people of Egypt for the most part, having this very optimistic outlook on life and being very concerned with preserving the balance in the world around them, because they felt that to not preserve that balance would result in making the river be out of whack. And that if the river was out of whack, that was a sign that something was wrong. So if you were Pharaoh and the river failed to flood, probably you weren't going to be Pharaoh for much longer. Does the author appear to have a bias or vested interest in any of the issues addressed? Well, yeah. I mean, the author appears to be some sort of priest, or certainly a very dedicated worshiper of the Nile, and he seems to have a vested interest in perpetuating that worship, let us say. All right, so that's the second level. We're trying to kind of like dig a little bit deeper, think critically about who the audience is, some basic assumptions. Next, we want to move on to some even broader questions. Can I believe this document? Can I believe this document? Well, here I think, and this again relates to the second question in that question, how reliable do you think it is likely to be? Here, I think you have to think about it situationally. You can believe, I don't know that we would believe that the Nile is a god. However, we could say that this reliably tells us what worshippers of the Nile thought. So sometimes you have to kind of be like, huh, okay, it's reliable in this sense, but it's not necessarily reliable in this other sense. What can I learn about the society that produced this document? Well, from this document, I've learned that the Nile is clearly very important to Egyptian society, that people worshipped it as a god, that it is seen as effectively the creator of all things. If we go back down here again, the creator of all good things. He's seen as being responsible for prosperity, and through that, not just for feeding the people of Egypt, but also for sustaining civilization. In fact, reading through this, it almost appears as though it is the Nile that is the ruler of Egypt, and not any of the other gods, and not the Pharaoh. Should I believe everything that the source tells me? Probably not. Probably you should never, ever believe everything. So, for example, if I think about this, does this mean that everybody held this view about the Nile? Probably not. And it's hard to take one document and to extrapolate it that way. Does this mean that people throughout the entirety of ancient Egyptian civilization held this view about the Nile? Probably not. So you want to think about the limitations of the document. What should I take away from this document? How should I understand it? Well, my takeaway from this document is that it's a demonstration of the significance of the Nile, and really of the sheer magnitude of of the role that the Nile played in the lives of people in ancient Egypt. How should I understand it? I see this source as one point of view, although probably a fairly common point of view. How is it related to other sources that I have read? Well, we have not actually read the precepts of Ptah-hotep yet, but as you read through those for the final section for this week, you'll have to think about how we can connect that to the Hymn to the Nile. And finally, what questions does this document raise in your mind? And this can be anything. I mean, really, I want you to be thinking beyond the document. After reading this document, I will admit I am interested in religion in general, and I'm really interested in the religious ceremonies that are kind of implied at certain points. So let's look for one of those. Okay, so here, for example, it is then that prayer is made for the annual water of the season. So they're talking about prayer for the inundation. Southern Egypt is seen in the same state as the north. That's actually kind of an interesting statement in itself, because Egypt was not, as you've learned from the textbook reading, always unified into one Egypt. Each one is with his instruments of labor. None remains behind his companions. None clothes himself with garments. The children of the noble put aside their ornaments. So it seems to be suggesting here that in this ceremony, they're all going to be standing without clothes, without any sort of ornaments that might differentiate between them. So effectively all equal before the Nile, supplicating the Nile with their prayers. And this is really intriguing, and I'd like to know more about this. Now, sometimes we have questions that we can answer with a visit to the textbook. Sometimes we have questions like this that might be more of a research question. Sometimes we have questions that are effectively unanswerable, although that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask them. So, I mean, your question might be, what percentage of the Egyptian population really bought into this? Well, I don't know. That's going to be a really hard one to actually answer. They're dead. It's hard to know exactly what they were thinking. But my point is that it is important to have questions. And so then, as now we're kind of in the wrap-up mode, so you want to think about the source, see if you have not managed to connect it to specific things from the reading, see if you can connect it to specific things from the reading. So again, we've talked about the significance of the flood for supporting Egyptian civilization. We've talked about this idea of ma'a, or balance, and the rather optimistic worldview of the Egyptian people. We could even bring in that interesting comment about the differentiation between North and South Egypt. All of these connect back to the textbook reading. So I hope that this has been helpful. Usually it doesn't take me this long to read a source. It probably shouldn't take you this long either. However, when I'm reading it out loud and narrating it, of course, it takes longer. Please feel free, if you have any questions about this source or sort of spinning from this analysis, to post them on the discussion board. And I look forward to chatting with you there.